All right, welcome to the final video for Module 17, where we're finishing up our chapter on body systems, which has taken us through two modules within the course. So far we've talked about this week we've talked about the muscular system, the skeletal system, and the endocrine system. Now we're going to finish up with the nervous system. Okay, so nervous system, big characteristics and functions of the nervous system is that it receives information from multiple different sources, and it's receiving that information simultaneously. So you're taking in information from your senses and from working organs and other kind of control systems within our body that's helping maintain homeostasis. And so all of this is working simultaneously at the same time. When it receives that information, it's integrating that information, it's processing it, it's compiling it, it's making sense of the information, it's making decisions on what needs to happen with our bodies so that we can maintain our cellular processes and maintain homeostasis. Now, all of this is happening extremely fast. So we're talking about responses that are as fast as tenths of a second. And it's initiating these specific responses to the information that it's receiving, causing things like muscular contractions, glandular secretion, so like with the endocrine system, conscious control over movement, emotions, behavior, thoughts, etc. So it's controlling all of that at the same time, running off of similar systems, which is just really crazy to think about. Now, we can divide our nervous system into two main parts. We have our central nervous system, which is known as the CNS. We have our peripheral nervous system, which is known as the PNS. Now, the central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and it's really important for receiving information, processing information, and then transferring that information to the appropriate place. The PNS are all of the nerves that are outside of the brain and the spinal cord. There's two different divisions. You have a sensory division, which is your input division. That brings information to the spinal cord. And then you have a motor division, which is your output division, and it brings information away from the spinal cord. And your motor division can be even further divided into a somatic and autonomic division. So somatic is like your voluntary control, and autonomic is your involuntary control division. So here we have a little figure just kind of showing these relationships. So you have the CNS, and all of these are the PNS. You have sensory neurons bringing information to the spinal cord, motor neurons providing output from the spinal cord, and that could be physical control, voluntary control, or non-voluntary control. Now, non-voluntary control, so the autonomic division, can be even further divided into the parasympathetic and the sympathetic division. These are related to your fight or flight responses, which we'll talk about towards the end of this module. Now, to begin with, we want to talk about neurons and talk about the structure of neurons so you understand how information is carried throughout that neuron. So neurons are the specialized cells that our bodies use for communication in our nervous system. They basically generate and conduct electrical impulses that are sent throughout our nervous system to stimulate specific responses. Now we have a couple of different types of neurons. You have your sensory neurons, your motor neurons, which we've just talked about. So sensory neurons bring information to the central nervous system. Motor neurons take information away from the central nervous system. You then have your inner neurons that transmit information between components of the central nervous system. So that's how information basically goes between the parts of that CNS, your central nervous system. Now, if we look at the structure of a neuron, there are three parts to the basic neuron structure. You have the cell body, which is the main part of the cell. This is where the nucleus, the cytoplasm, and all the organelles are located. Then, off of the cell body, you have these little finger-like projections that are called dendrites. These dendrites take information from adjacent cells. They could be tissue cells or other neurons, but they'll take that information and they'll transmit it to the next appropriate cell or target cell, which is another neuron or a muscle or some other type of cell that information needs to go to. And so the dendrites receive it. They receive incoming information. Axons will conduct electrical impulses away from the cell body. So you basically have your dendrites, your cell body, and then your axon. And your axon is this long extension that will connect to whatever target cell that impulse needs to go to. So for example here, we have a couple of different neurons. You have your sensory neuron, you have an interneuron, and then you have your motor neuron. So you're bringing information to the CNS, right, through this sensory neuron. This is your motor neuron. So that those dendrites on that interneuron are picking up information coming from that sensory neuron. And then it transmits that electrical impulse through the axon to the dendrites of the motor neuron. And then the axon will take that stimulus to the muscle cell so that it can respond appropriately. Okay? So neurons transmit these electrical pulses in the form of action potentials. Action potentials are how the nervous system communicates. Now, you're probably saying, what is an action potential? Well, an action potential is an impulse that is the result of a change in the electrical charge of a neuron cell. And so to understand how this happens, we first have to talk about what's called the resting potential of a neuron. So a neuron has a protein that's called a sodium-potassium pump. And this protein sits in the cell membrane of the neuron. And what this pump does is it helps to maintain the cell volume, and it establishes the resting potential of these neurons. The resting potential of the neuron is the difference in voltage from the inside of the neuron versus the outside of the neuron, so across the membrane. And the resting membrane potential is minus 70 millivolts. So the inside of the neuron in the cytoplasm of the axon is more negative than the interstitial fluid that is outside of the cell. So the interior of the cell is more negative relative to the exterior. And the way this happens is that the sodium-potassium pump will transport 3 sodium ions out of the cell and bring in 2 potassium ions, okay? And what you want to notice is these ions are both positive, right? So if you're losing 3 positive ions and you're bringing in 2 positive ions, right? You cross those out, you have a difference of 1. So there's 1 ion that's positive that's going out, and you're removing more positive ions than what you're bringing in. So that means on the interior portion of the cell, you're going to be more negative than the exterior, because you've got 3 positive going out and only 2 positive going in. And so that sodium-potassium pump establishes that resting membrane potential. Okay, And what that means is at any given point, if the neuron is not active, if there's no stimulus going through it, inside of the cell should be around minus 70 millivolts. Okay. Now, whenever a stimulus happens, there can be called there can occur what's called a graded potential. A graded potential is just a local change in the resting potential of that neuron. Now, it can cause the neuron to depolarize or hyperpolarize. Okay? If it's depolarization, then it goes up in value, so it becomes less negative. If it hyperpolarizes the resting potential, then it becomes even more negative. Okay, so depolarization would be like from minus 70 to minus 30. Hyperpolarization would be like minus 70 to minus 90, right? So it becomes more negative. Now, what's interesting is you can have back-to-back stimuli that will cause back-to-back graded potentials that can add up in space and time. And this leads to the process called summation. And so this additive effect may cause the resting membrane potential to depolarize enough to reach a trigger point, which is known as the threshold. And so if that depolarization reaches a threshold, an action potential will occur. And so this is what that looks like. So you have your resting potential, you have a graded potential here. And this is a depolarizing graded potential because it becomes less negative. Here is a graded potential, and it's a hyperpolarizing graded potential because it becomes more negative. Here you have two stimuli in a row. So each arrow refers to a stimulus. So here you have two stimulus back to back. And so it causes two graded potentials in a quick enough fashion to where they add together. And so basically you get a summation event. So the two graded potentials together cause a higher depolarization, a larger depolarization than either one of them individually. So you get that summation. Now here you get three stimuli to sum together, and the depolarization reaches a trigger point. And here the trigger point is minus 50 millivolts. So as soon as that trigger point is met, an action potential happens. And an action potential is an all or none process. You either have an action potential or you don't. So if that trigger point is met, you have this typical curve in depolarization and repolarization to happen. And this is the action potential, right? So this here is the action potential. And so once that trigger point is met, this action potential either happens or it doesn't. There's no like intermediate action potential or like halfway action potential. It's an all or none process, okay? Now, when that threshold is met, that action potential happens, and you have two parts of an action potential. You have a depolarization phase and you have a repolarization phase. The depolarization phase is the increase in voltage, right? So becoming more positive. The repolarization is the hyperpolarization where it becomes more negative. And what's interesting is it actually becomes what's called hyperpolarized, because let's say this is minus 70, right there. So during repolarization, it will actually get below minus 70 and become hyperpolarized for a brief amount of time before it restabilizes its resting membrane potential, which is at minus 70. And so the way this depolarization and hyperpolarization works is that the graded potentials that cause the trigger to happen, when that trigger happens, there are voltage sensitive sodium channels that will open. And so what this causes is a bunch of, so let's say you have your axon membrane, right? This is the outside of the cell, and then here you have the inside of the cell. What it causes is a bunch of Na to flood in, right? All of these are positive, so if a bunch of sodium ions come flooding in, you're going to become more positive, right? You're going to depolarize. So this reverses the voltage across the membrane. So the interior becomes positive. So it goes from negative to positive, right? Now, repolarization happens after the Na channels close and the potassium channels open. So the potassium channels will open and potassium will flood out. And as the potassium goes flooding out, you have positive ions moving back out. And so this causes hyperpolarization to happen, right? So it becomes, it's basically repolarizing, okay? And then these potassium channels don't shut off at the point in which the resting membrane potential becomes minus 70 millivolts again. They stay open for a little while longer, and that causes more sodium ions to go out than necessary to reestablish that resting membrane potential. So it basically overshoots that resting membrane potential and becomes hyperpolarized for a little bit. And then the normal functions of the sodium potassium pump will bring that back up to resting membrane potential. So here's a figure just kind of showing that process. So you have your sodium potassium pump here, and then here you have your channels that open whenever you get a certain voltage change. So when that graded potential hits that threshold, your sodium channels open up, sodium comes flooding in. And so this orange graph here shows the amount of sodium that's moving across the membrane. And then this shows it going down as it closes. And as it starts going down, the potassium starts going up. And so that causes the repolarization. And then the potassiums will close. And notice you have this hyperpolarization here. And then now it's back at resting membrane potential. Okay? So you have that opening of Na floods in, close, opening of potassium floods out, depolarization, repolarization, hyperpolarization, reestablish resting membrane potential. So all of those processes are part of a single action potential, okay? And so like I mentioned, the action potential is all or none. Once it triggered, it's always going to happen at the same speed and the same voltage. So this voltage here, this plus 30, is the action potential that you will always see in that specific neuron. Now, I think we'll mention it later, but I want to go ahead and mention it while it's on my mind in case I forget. The only way you get a change in the speed and the voltage of the action potentials is if you have different neurons. So for example, the larger the neuron, the faster the speed and the faster the voltage that it can carry. Think of it as like a drop cord. The bigger around the drop cord, the more energy you can carry and the farther away you can carry it. So your neurons are the same way. So the diameter of the axons actually calls for greater speed, right? And what's interesting is that action potentials are self-propagating. So let's say you have a neuron, right? This is an axon. And let's say you have a stimulus and you get an action potential to happen in this area. So the sodium channels open, the sodium comes in, potassium goes out. What that's going to do is stimulate an action potential here. So you'll have that same thing to happen. And then it'll stimulate there. And then it'll stimulate again. And so it propagates, it self-propagates down the axon, carrying that electrical impulse like a wave at a constant speed and amplitude. Okay. And so, okay, yeah, here it is. So the number of action potentials per unit of time is what determines the strength of the stimulus. So a stronger stimuli will generate more action potentials per unit of time. And then the speed of the action potential is always the same for a particular neuron. But since we have different types of neurons, neurons can have different diameters in their axons. And so a larger diameter axon can have an action potential travel at a much greater speed than a neuron with a smaller diameter. Okay. All right, so now what we're going to talk about is how these neurons can have these electrical stimuli be propagated efficiently. And it comes from the fact that the neurons are actually surrounded by neuroglial cells. So neuroglial cells make up 80% of the nervous system cells. They have a couple of different functions. One is for support and protection. And as we'll see, it also helps with the transmission of the electrical impulses within these neurons. The glial cells do not transmit the action potentials, but it helps with the efficiency of those, the movement of those action potentials. Okay? There are two types of glial cells. You have Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes. Okay. All right. So neurons will target either another neuron, a muscle cell, or a particular gland. There is what's called a synapse that occurs between the junction of the end of an axon, so the axon terminus, and that target cell. So for example, in our muscle video, the video that was before this one, you had that terminal bulb that met the muscle cell, right? And so this was the axon terminal, and then this is the muscle, right? And the synapse is this gap here. This is the junction between the axon terminus and the target cell. And so the synaptic transmission is the impulse from the sending neuron across the synaptic cleft to the target cell. So this gap is the synaptic cleft. So here you have this presynaptic neuron, and it will send neurotransmitters across this synaptic cleft that will bind to the little receptors that are on this muscle cell, and that will cause a stimulus in the muscle cell. Right? Each neuron at each target has a different chemical neurotransmitter that will transmit across that synaptic cleft depending on the process that it's going to stimulate or cause a response for. Okay? And so this is just how that synaptic transmission occurs. So at the action potential, as the action potential arrives at the axon terminus, it causes calcium to move into that axon bulb. That calcium causes those neurotransmitters to release from vesicles across the synaptic cleft, and then those neurotransmitters will bind to receptors. And then those receptors will open gated channels and cause a graded potential that happens from sodium diffusing across the membrane of the target cell. And so I have a better drawing here. It's way better than the drawing I just did. But you have your axon bulb here. You have your calcium ions moving down, triggering those vesicles that are these little yellow spheres that contain the neurotransmitters to release those neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. So if we zoom into this area, which is here, you can see those neurotransmitters binding to those gated channels. Once that gated channel is open, the sodium will flood in and you'll have action potentials to form. And so it's transmitting that impulse from the neuron, from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron. Basically is how that's happening. And so with the information, right, being carried throughout the body, your PNS will relay information between tissues and the central nervous system. So a nerve is basically many axons that are wrapped together in a protected sheath, and it carries information to and from the central nervous system. We have 12 cranial nerves that are directly connected to the brain, and then we have 31 spinal nerves, 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and I should have said 12 pairs. So 31 pairs of spinal nerves that connect to our spinal cord. And so again, that's bringing that information from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. And it's providing information for both either the voluntary movement, so somatic control, or autonomic control, so that involuntary movement of the peripheral nervous system. And again, that intercoming information comes in as action potentials from those sensory neurons. So across that synaptic cleft from a peripheral neuron to a central neuron. Like we mentioned, the somatic division controls the voluntary movement, so those somatic muscles. So voluntary is your conscious control of all of the skeletal muscles. But we still can have involuntary reflexes of those skeletal muscles. So for example, we have what's called spinal reflexes. So these are involuntary responses that are mediated by the spinal cord and spinal nerves, and this involves the brain very minimally. So the brain isn't really involved with these quick reflexes. Some of the examples of these reflexes is the flexor reflex, the cross extensor reflex, and a stretch reflex. So stretch reflex is really important for maintaining upright posture, and we'll look at these other examples of these other reflexes right here. So here we have some spinal reflexes. So let's say you step on something painful, piece of glass or a nail, and immediately you'll pick your foot up, triggered by that pain. And that happens extremely fast, right? And that's all because of this spinal reflex, okay? So basically what happens is you step on that painful stimulus that brings information via a sensory neuron to the central nervous system. That then will transmit information to the motor neuron that will tell the effector muscles to do something. And so this will tell this muscle to contract, to lift that leg up, and then you'll get a cross extensor reflex to send information across to tell the opposite leg to extend and brace for the weight that's going to come about it whenever this flexor reflex happens and withdraws that leg. Okay? And so this happens almost instantaneously, right? So this is a very quick reflex towards that stimulus. Now, the autonomic division controls those involuntary functions, right? So this is also part of the peripheral nervous system, but it's with those cardiac and smooth muscle tissues that we don't control consciously. And it consists of two divisions, a sympathetic division and a parasympathetic division. Both sympathetic motor neurons and parasympathetic neurons basically surround each organ. And with the sympathetic division, this prepares your body for emergencies. So norepinephrine is the key neurotransmitter here. and it produces these fight or flight responses. So like really fast heart rate, increased respiration, like when you get scared, how you breathe really heavily, your heart beats really fast, your blood pressure rises, your pupils dilate, and your body also slows its digestion process and urine production process during these fight or flight responses. And so all of these organs will generally get a unified response. So it all happens simultaneously. And the sympathetic division directly opposes the parasympathetic division. And so the parasympathetic division is the opposite. It's what relaxes the body. And the key neurotransmitter here is acetylcholine. So it's the exact opposite of those sympathetic responses. So you lower your heart rate, you have slower respiration rates, you increase digestion, you permit defecation and urination, your pupils don't dilate. And so it's, again, kind of more of a relaxed state. So parasympathetic is more of a relaxed state versus your sympathetic state. And they're working together to maintain homeostasis within the body. And so here are examples of the parasympathetic division and the sympathetic division. Right? So dilation, decreased salivation, increased breathing heart rates, constriction of blood vessels, where opposite happens in parasympathetic. Constricting pupils, decreased respiration heart rates, dilates blood vessels, more of this relaxed state. All right, so now what we're going to get into is the central nervous system. So we're going to finish up talking about the brain and the spinal cord. Okay? So the central nervous system protection comes from the bone. So we've talked about this in the last video. So the skull and the vertebrae protecting both the brain and the spinal cord. But there's also three other mechanisms that provide protection. So you have the meninges, which are these protective membranes. So you have three meninges. These is the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. You have the cerebrospinal fluid, which basically bathes the central nervous system in that fluid, and it serves as a shock absorber, and it's actually produced within the brain, within these ventricles of the brain. And then you have what's called a blood-brain barrier. So this prevents entry of specific chemicals and pathogens into the brain to try to prevent those from harming the brain. Now here's the structure of the brain. You have your skull, right, that surrounds and encases the brain. You have your different meninges, so your dura mater, your arachnoid, your cerebrospinal fluid, and then the pia mater. And the pia mater directly encases the brain tissue. You have your different ventricles here, which is where the cerebrospinal fluid is made. And that cerebrospinal fluid will move throughout the brain, surrounds it down the spinal cord and back up, and just kind of bathes the central nervous system in that cerebrospinal fluid. Now, the spinal cord is really important for relaying information to the brain and to the peripheral nervous, the PNS, so back and forth, right? And so you can think of it as this freeway or superhighway of information. The spinal cord is made up into kind of two different segments. You have the white matter and the gray matter areas of the spinal cord. The white matter is the outer portion of the spinal cord and is made up of your sensory and motor nerve tracts. So your ascending and descending tracts. Okay, so ascending is sensory, descending is your motor. The gray matter is the center portion of the spinal cord, and it's the cell body and the dendrites of those ascending and descending nerve tracts. So here we have an image, right? So if we have a cross section of the spinal cord, the butterfly looking shape, the darker shape, is the gray matter. So that is the dendrites and the cell bodies. And then the white matter is the myelinated neurons. So it's like the axons, the sensory and motor neurons that are taking the information up and down that spinal cord. Now, the spinal cord is also surrounded by the meninges. You have the dura mater, the arachnoid, and then the pia mater. And then your nerves travel between the pia and the arachnoid. Now, with the brain is basically the command center, the console of the body. This is where kind of everything is processed and information is sent out. Responses are made, are pushed out to all of the other organs in the body and tissues and all other parts of the body. There are 3 divisions of the brain. You have a hindbrain, a midbrain, and a forebrain. Your hindbrain coordinates basic autonomic tasks. Your midbrain coordinates your muscle groups and responses to certain stimuli like sight and sound. And then your forebrain integrates sensory input and basically determines a lot of our complex behavior. So first we'll look at the hindbrain, which is the oldest part of the brain from an evolutionary perspective. So some of the earlier formed brains in the animal tree only had the hindbrain parts. And then the midbrain and forebrain are the more recently evolved parts of the brain. Now, the hindbrain has 3 basic parts: the medulla oblongata, the cerebrum, and the pons. So we'll see that here. So here's your hindbrain. There is the medulla oblongata. I said cerebrum a while ago. I meant cerebellum. The cerebellum and the pons. Your forebrain is shown here, and the thalamus, but we'll talk more about those when we get there. Now, the medulla oblongata directly connects to the spinal cord and determines the autonomic functions of internal organs. So it's regulating the functioning of those organs. So for example, the cardiovascular center, it's important for regulating our heart rate and our blood pressure, and it adjusts our respiration rate so our bodies can take in the appropriate amount of oxygen and make sure we're getting rid of the carbon dioxide. Motor nerves actually cross over in the medulla oblongata. So you get a switch. So nerves from the right forebrain actually control the left side of the body, and the left forebrain actually controls the right side of the body because of this crossing over in the medulla oblongata. Now, the cerebellum is important for basic body movement. So those skilled movements like tying a shoe, swinging a bat, hand-eye coordination, those types of movements. So whenever you consume alcohol, that chemical is going up into the cerebellum because alcohol is one of the few chemicals that can pass that blood-brain barrier, and it affects the cerebellum, which in turn affects your basic motor skilled movements. Now, the pons is the connection from the higher brain center to the spinal cord, and it basically coordinates the information flow between the higher brain centers and the cerebellum itself, and it helps the medulla oblongata in terms of regulating respiration. Now, moving into the midbrain, which is responsible for our vision, our hearing, sleep, and wakefulness cycles. So this helps with coordinated movements of the head, so how we can, peripheral vision, regular vision, hearing, that type of movements. It controls movements of the eyes, so like dilation and constriction of pupils. And it's also has the neurons that are involved in regulating our sleep and wakefulness cycles. So basically, one group of neurons will have a steady stream of action potentials in the cerebrum to keep us awake. And then another group of neurons, which is our sleep center, will release serotonin that helps to induce sleep. So if you have issues with sleeping, you may get prescribed some medication that have serotonin that's supposed to help you induce that sleep. Now with the forebrain, this is where we see a lot of our emotions and conscious thought. And the forebrain has a couple of different components. It has the cerebrum, which is the large hemispheres of the brain. When you talk about a brain, that's probably what you think about, is the cerebrum. It also has the limbic system, which is involved in emotions and memory. We have our thalamus, which is the receiving, processing, and transfer center of the information as it comes into the CNS. And then we have the hypothalamus, which is responsible for regulation of homeostasis. So remember when we talked about the endocrine system, the hypothalamus will release hormones that affect the pituitary gland that can then release hormones that affect other components of our body. And so the hypothalamus is found in the forebrain of our brain. Now, the limbic system is involved, like we said, in emotions, so things like motivation, behavior, gratification behaviors, thirst, seeking food, whether you're scared, whether you're afraid, whether you're sad, whether you feel love. So all of that comes from the area of the limbic system, which is shown here in this figure. So your limbic system is the areas kind of colored in this dark green. Your hypothalamus is shown here. Your thalamus, your cerebrum are these large hemispheres. And then there's the corpus callosum, which allows the two hemispheres of the cerebrum to communicate with one another. Our brain part there. So the cerebrum itself is basically dealing with higher brain function. Like we mentioned, it's divided into two hemispheres, so a left and a right hemisphere. Those two hemispheres are connected by the corpus callosum, which allows for that communication and the sharing of information between those two hemispheres. And the cerebral cortex, which is our gray matter, is actually the outer layer of the cerebrum itself. We got an image kind of showing that cerebral cortex in about 2 slides. So taking a look at the cerebral cortex, actually right here, the cerebral cortex has a lot of different functions: memory storage, abstract thought, awareness, conscious movement, visual information, and so just a lot of processes that the cerebral cortex is responsible for. And we can divide the cerebral cortex into 4 different lobes that are corresponding to the types of, or the area of the cranial area that they're located. There we go. So for example, the occipital lobe, which is in the occipital region, is responsible for visual information. The temporal lobe, which is in the temporal region, interprets auditory information, spoken, written language. The parietal lobe, which is in the parietal region, so kind of the top portion of the head, interprets and receives sensory information, say from the skin. And then your frontal lobe, which is the frontal area, your forehead area, is responsible for speech, conscious thought, and then all 4 lobes are responsible for memory storage. So here we have the location of those lobes. And so you can see the cerebral cortex is the outer area of the cerebrum. And so this is your temporal area, your occipital, parietal, and then frontal, which is down in here. And so you can see they're just the outer area of the cerebrum. And then there's the corpus callosum that's allowing those 2 hemispheres to communicate with one another. And so that's it for our nervous system video. Hopefully you took away a lot from it. I know these last couple videos were dense, had a lot of information. I felt like I might have rushed through some stuff. So if you have any questions, make sure you email me or ask in the discussion section. And so, yeah, that does it for this module. We've now finished the body systems, so both parts 1 and 2. And so we'll see you in the next module. So have a good day and have a good week.